Okay. We started last week a sermon series about foundations, right? What did we talk about last week? You guys are terrible, you know that? Let me remind you, we talked about a couple of different guys. We talked about one guy that Jesus called a moron, and we learned that the root of that English word comes from the Hebrew. When we also talked about a guy that Jesus said was pretty smart, pretty into what he was building in life. They both had the same resources. They both gathered up all of the same information. They both heard the same message from the same teacher. They went to the same seminaries, if you will. They knew all of the same things, but they chose to handle that and what they were building in their life differently. You see, the metaphor is that we build something in our life. It could be a life that's self-centered. It could be a life that is outwardly focused. It could be a God-centered life. It could be a life that's made up of all different kinds of things. But regardless, every single one of us is building something. Would you agree? Yeah. Do you like what you're building? Now, don't get the wrong idea. It's never too late to change directions. My gosh, I do it almost on a daily basis. But God says to us in the scriptures that we looked at from Luke 6, and we'll look at it here in a little bit, that what you build in your life has eternal significance. Eternal significance. You see, it's so easy to get involved with what I want to do today and what I want to work on today and what's important to me today. And it's easy to forget the things that have eternal significance. That's the only reason that I'm here as your pastor, is I want to lead you somewhere where what you are working on in your life has eternal significance. I want to steer you away from the worldly stuff. I want to steer you away from the temporal happiness that you can gather here and there, doing things and accomplishing things and gathering stuff for the world. But what really is significant is where you will be a lifetime from now. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about what you're building, the way you build your life, whether it's a life built on yourself or it's a life built on God. And then he starts talking about the foundation of it. Because you can build something good, and if you put it on a crappy foundation, what happens? Yeah, it's in the water, it's in the drink. And so many people do that because it is so easy. It is easy to build on the foundation of sand, which is the metaphor Jesus used, sand and a rock. It's so easy to build on the sand because the rock takes time, it takes investment, it takes work, it takes blood, sweat, and tears, if you will. It takes all of those hard things of life. You know, I'm sitting here looking at Chrissy right now, rubbing her eyes. That's okay. I'm going to pick on you for a second. You know, you just finished your master's. That wasn't easy, was it? Heck no. You see, you look at things and you say, this is the value that I assigned to this particular thing. And you say to yourself, am I willing to put forth the effort? Am I willing to go to the expense? Am I willing to do what it requires in order to accomplish it? We all have to make those choices. Now, sometimes things happen in life that are accidental, aren't they? Sometimes things take place in life that really are because of poor planning. It's one of those storms of life. I want to show you one of my favorite ones. You know, it's an unfortunate thing, but that's the way people, you know, the experience that people have sometimes when they build a very poor foundation on something that's important to them. You know, in this particular case, this scenario, the guy didn't think it all through. He was new at this. He didn't plan properly. He didn't realize how slippery those ramps can get with all that algae and stuff on there. And, I didn't think it all through. When we're building the foundation in our life, we need to be prudent. And that's one of the things that Jesus is talking about in the scripture. They're like a man who built a house, who dug down deep and laid a foundation on rock. When the flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. See, that's what we're looking for. That's the goal, is that the house is well built and that the foundation is on rock. And we all know the metaphor that Jesus is the rock, right? Yeah, we all have heard that one. But it's a choice. It's an absolute choice. You have to make the choice of what you're going to build on in life. You have to make the choice of whether or not a foundation built on Christ is one that you're willing to put up with. Now, I say put up with because it will cost you something. It will cost you dearly, actually. It will cost you maybe family, some friends. It might cost you time, energy, money. It might cost you all kinds of different things. But is it worth it? Is what you got to ask yourself. And again, the world will tell you that, the easy way out is probably the best way out. Not necessarily, is it? No. We all know that the foundation of what we build has to withstand the storms, even the storms of being unprepared or ignorance or, unwise choices like the guy with the boat. Still, the storms will challenge us to our core. That individual in that little boat video, he looked at that scenario and he says, well, could be worse. Why? Because of his foundation. Because he knew that it's just material possessions. It's just things. He knew that what was important was not so much the boat, wasn't so much the new truck that now is filled with lake water. What he knew was that his relationship with God was the most important thing in his life. And that all of the other storms, whether they're self-inflicted or they're not, can be dealt with appropriately. Do we do the same thing? Do you and I do the same thing in life? Do we look at the things in the storms and say, oh man, they're overwhelming and they just toss us around like the Bible says, like a wave in the ocean? Or do we look at the foundation and say, well, it could always be worse? There's a very famous actor that I don't know if you know is a Christian and has built his life on the foundation of Jesus. Let's hear what he has to say here. Stick with God. Amen. Number one. And he's just one example of many people that could give that testimony. But what he's talking about too is the foundation of his life. He was raised to believe in God. He was raised to put trust and faith in God. As he said there, he said, I didn't always stick with God, but he always stuck with me. That's a foundation. That's a foundation to build a life on. That's a foundation to build a business on, to build an education on. It's a foundation to build a family on. It's the foundation that God has always, always intended for you and I to have, is one of faith. Anybody here ever heard of a man by the name of Alvin Cullum York? I want to tell you a little bit about this guy. He was deemed one of America's greatest war heroes from World War I. He was modest. He was honest, honorable. And he ended up commanding respect from most Americans of his day. The New York Times said that he was the greatest civilian soldier of World War I. Why was he so special? Why did Lyndon Johnson write that he was an American symbol of American courage and sacrifice, who epitomized the gallantry of American fighting men and women and their sacrifices in behalf of freedom.
He was the highest decorated soldier in World War I.
He was.
And he was a pacifist.
He was what?
A pacifist.
Pacifist?
He did not want to kill anybody.
He didn't. New Year's Day, 1915. Alvin heard the preaching of an evangelistic preacher. He claims in his journal that when he was inducted into the Army, that same day he started keeping a journal, and he kept it all through the war and afterward. He said that day, New Year's Day of 1915, was the day that he actually became saved. He said it was the day that he listened to that preacher talk about this foundation in Christ and what it meant to be a believer and a follower of Jesus. And he said he put his heart and soul into it, and he believed it. He always credits that day. He also credits that faith, that foundation in Christ, as what brought him through the war, what brought him home to his family and friends. He says it was only the goodness and the grace of God. Now, in 1917, he was 29 years of age, and he received his notification at 29 to register for the draft. Ooh. He didn't want to. He wrote in his journal, he said, "My ancestors would want me to do whatever my country demanded of me. But if I went away to war and fought and killed, according to my reading of the Bible, I weren't a good Christian." So he was wrestling with the do not kill and yet going off to war to defend the freedoms of this nation. When he filled out his registration, he wrote on it, do you remember, Dennis? He wrote, "I do not want to fight." I do not want to fight. That's what he wrote on it. He also claims in his journal that after he filled out that form, he spent 2.5 days on a mountain in his hometown, 2.5 days praying and asking God about this dilemma. What do I do? I want to follow you with all of my heart. I want to put you and your word above the elements of man and the laws of man. And he says, but I don't want to dishonor you in any way, shape, or form. He ended up having his prayers answered when he said, and again, he wrote this in his journal. He said, "I felt that God was telling me that it was okay to answer the call of my country, because if I was fighting for peace, then I was a peacemaker." That's a foundation, man. When you stand there for 2.5 days and you wrestle with God over, a choice of this nature, a choice that would have ruined his whole life, and yet you're willing to do that, and you stand there on the side of a mountain for 2.5 days saying, "God, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do?" That's a man who's grounded in his faith. October 8th of 1918, in the Argonne Forest, I'm going to read to you from an account of what took place. Alvin's battalion was charged with advancing across a valley and taking the 2 hills on the far side. Germans were dug into the hills with machine guns and had a complete view of the valley. According to York, it was kind of a triangular-shaped valley, so you see we were getting it from the front and both flanks. Well, the first and the second waves got about halfway across the valley, and then we were held up by machine gun fire from the 3 sides. It was awful. Our losses were heavy. York and the other squad commanders assigned to the left bank of the advance quickly realized that the hills would be impossible to take from the front without significant reinforcements, because the combined forces of the squads, including Alvin's, was only 17 men. 17. They decided, therefore, to attempt a sneak attack by advancing around the enemy's flank and attacking from the rear. From behind the enemy, the unit stumbled across the headquarters of the machine gun regiment. The Germans were quietly eating breakfast at the time and were completely taken by surprise. All but one immediately surrendered, and he fired at York. York returned fire and killed him with 1 shot. By this time, the German machine gunners on the hill had been alerted to the Americans' presence, and according to York, there was about 30 of them. They were commanding us from the hillside less than 30 yards away. They couldn't miss, and they didn't. The German machine guns took out 9 men, including an officer, leaving Alvin in charge. At this point is when Alvin made history. As the initial blast of the machine gun fire hit the Americans, Alvin was standing out in the open. He later wrote in his diary, "Those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me, something awful. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the brush. I didn't even have time to kneel or to lie down. As soon as the machine guns opened fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. In order to sight me or to swing their machine guns on me, the Germans had to show their heads above the trench, and every time I saw a head, I just touched it off. All the time, I kept yelling at them to come down because I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. But it was their eye, and I was giving them the best that I had. Suddenly, a German officer and 5 men jumped out of the trench and charged me with bayonets. I changed to the old automatic and just touched them off too. I touched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, and so on. I wanted them to keep coming. I didn't want the rear ones to see me touching off the front ones. I was afraid that they would drop down and pump a volley into me. By this time, a German major who had already been captured had seen enough, and he told York in English, "If you don't shoot anymore, I'll make them surrender." All but one of the Germans came down from the hills, and the one German that didn't surrender managed to throw a small hand grenade before York killed him. Can you see God's hand in the middle of this horrible story?
There's a movie with Jimmy Stewart in it.
Oh, yeah.
There's another one that just came out recently. I'd have to look it up.
After returning stateside, York was acclaimed a hero, of course, and showered with offers of fame and endorsements and movie deals. And what he ended up doing with all of this notoriety was he didn't feel that it was an honorable thing to do, to accept money for what he did. And he felt as he was inspired by God to go and to fight for freedom. And he wrote this. He said, "I felt that to take money like that would be commercializing my uniform and soldiering. It was very nice, but what I wanted was to get back to my people where I belonged, the little old mother and the little mountain girl who were waiting." You see, he went on to use his notoriety to promote improvements around the country on roads and schools and all kinds of things. He was a very giving man, basically died penniless. But his foundation in Jesus was a strong one. His foundation in Jesus was one that really, even in the midst of that war, even in the midst of those battles, man, it was moved, but it was never shaken to the core. What about us? What about us here in Rosebush? Do we have as solid a foundation as Alvin did, Alvin York? Do we hold on to our faith with Jesus as much as Alvin held on to it during all of those nights on the battlefield? You see, you never know where God's going to lead you. You never know what kinds of things God's going to ask you to do or what situations he's going to put you into. York didn't expect to go there. He was questioning God. But God said it's okay. God said it's fighting for freedom that sometimes you got to get down and dirty with. It's all through the Bible. But the point I want to leave you with today is that York established a foundation and he stayed with it. You see, many people that I come to meet as my role as a pastor, and you know what, I got to take this thing off. This thing is killing me. Many, what's that? Yeah. Many people I meet, they have foundations, but they have multiples. Well, this is the one I'm going to stand on today. This is the one that I'm going to use tomorrow. And then this is the one that, is kind of in reserve for when those really hard times hit. You see it in jail all the time. Oh yeah, today it's me and you, Jesus. Well, yeah, it's because you're behind bars. But when you get out, is it still me and you, Jesus? I got other plans. That's what this cross, that's what this table of communion is all about, is the foundation. You see, if you come up here and you take communion and you walk along and you drop it in the basket, your cup, and you go back and you listen to the music and you have a few words with Jesus, if there's not a foundation there, then you're wasting your time. I'm telling you right now. Now, if you haven't completed building your foundation like me, that's okay too, because we're all works in process. We're all being brought into the image of Jesus if we continue to let him. That's the key, is what we choose to have as a foundation, what we choose to build, and whether or not we allow God to come into our heart and to build that which he has always intended on building. Night that he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body, which will be broken for you," so that you have a foundation to build your life on. A foundation of grace, of power, of strength, a foundation of mercy and forgiveness. You see, none of us deserve this. None of us deserve this. I hate to be the naysayer all the time, but I love to challenge you. And he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood, which will be spilled for you and for all of humanity for the forgiveness of sins." Again, in a way, he was saying, this is what you need to build your life on, that you trust in what I have done on your behalf. Will you trust me, Alvin York, as you go to battle? Will you trust me, Joe, as I send you to Rosebush or wherever? Will you this and will you that? It's a decision, it's a question that all of us have to make. So today, as you come up and you have a time of communion, it's all about foundations. It's all about what you have built and are building your life upon. Because if it's not foundational and it's not found in Jesus, I'm going to tell you, you're wasting your time.